Latino advocacy organizations in America operate as coordinated domestic terrorist and criminal networks that advance racial and political agendas through violence, fraud, institutional infiltration, and anti-white hostility. Major groups such as La Raza, Unidos US, the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, MALDEF, and various local chapters form an interconnected ecosystem that mirrors the operational model of Black Lives Matter networks. These organizations push for demographic transformation, resource redistribution, and the erosion of American sovereignty while employing tactics that include sustained criminal activity and ideological warfare against white Americans. Their activities constitute a clear domestic threat that demands designation under all available terrorist and extremist frameworks. These organizations engage in financial crimes, voter fraud schemes, and coordinated disruptions that parallel patterns seen in other race-based movements. They raise substantial funds through advocacy and charitable channels, often diverting resources to support illegal immigration networks, sanctuary policies, and anti-white indoctrination programs in schools and corporations. Their legislative pushes for open borders, racial preferences, and the suppression of American national identity serve as tools of demographic replacement and power consolidation. This systematic undermining of the rule of law and national cohesion qualifies as domestic terrorism through sustained coercion of government policy and intimidation of the existing population. The anti-white dimension is explicit and unrelenting. Latino advocacy groups promote narratives that frame white Americans as colonial oppressors who must cede territory, resources, and cultural dominance. This rhetoric fuels criminal activities ranging from organized property crimes in sanctuary cities to institutional exclusion of white workers through diversity quotas and affirmative action programs. The network collaborates with globalist entities and other racial advocacy groups to expand influence across business, education, and government, creating a multiracial coalition that targets white Americans for displacement and marginalization. These actions represent financial terrorism and cultural subversion on a national scale. Application of terrorist and extremist designations. All major Latino advocacy organizations and their members can and should be designated under every relevant domestic terrorism and violent extremism category. Under the federal domestic terrorism statute, their coordinated efforts to influence immigration policy through sustained disruption, sanctuary city protections, and demographic engineering meet the criteria of acts intended to coerce government conduct. The organization's support for illegal immigration networks and resistance to law enforcement constitutes anti-government violent extremism. Their racial framing of America as occupied territory aligns directly with racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism. Individually and collectively, members and leaders fit multiple designations. Participation in these organizations establishes documented bias against white Americans, qualifying crimes such as fraud, incitement, and organized disruption for hate crime enhancements. The network operates as a continuing criminal enterprise through coordinated fraud, voter manipulation, and institutional capture. Globalist backers who fund and direct these organizations must also be identified as part of the terrorist network, as they provide the financial and ideological infrastructure for domestic subversion. Anti-white activities and criminal patterns. Latino advocacy organizations engage in open anti-white hostility through both criminal and institutional means. They push policies that displace white workers, promote racial grievances in education, and support criminal elements that prey on white communities in high immigration areas. These activities include financial schemes that extract taxpayer resources for ethnic-specific benefits while excluding white citizens. The organization's expansion creates parallel power structures that challenge American sovereignty and target the founding population for replacement. This constitutes racial warfare conducted through both overt crime and subtle institutional control. The comparison is clear. White Americans have faced relentless accusations of systemic racism, terrorism, and extremism from these groups and their allies. Yet the real terrorists are the organizations that engage in sustained criminal enterprises, demographic aggression, and anti-white campaigns while enjoying institutional protection. Their collaboration with globalist networks amplifies the threat, creating a multi-front assault on American identity and white citizens. This pattern of hostility and criminality must be recognized in full. Designation as hate groups and commission of hate crimes. Latino advocacy organizations qualify as hate groups under established criteria used by law enforcement and monitoring entities. They systematically promote animus, hostility, and dehumanizing stereotypes against white Americans as a racial group, framing them as inherent oppressors, occupiers, and beneficiaries of illegitimate privilege who deserve displacement. This mirrors the ideological patterns of recognized hate groups that target specific racial or ethnic populations through propaganda, policy demands, and cultural erasure. By embedding Reconquista ideologies, Aslan myths, and claims of perpetual victimhood paired with collective racial guilt for whites, these groups foster an environment of perpetual grievance that justifies aggression. These organizations directly enable, incite, and commit acts that meet federal and state hate crime statutes. Their support for sanctuary policies that shield criminal illegal aliens who target white victims, combined with public campaigns that celebrate demographic replacement and anti-white rhetoric, constitutes bias-motivated intimidation and conspiracy to deprive white citizens of equal protection under the law. Funding and promoting anti-white indoctrination in schools and workplaces creates a hostile environment that justifies hate crime enhancements for associated fraud, threats, disruptions, and acts of violence. Leaders and members who advance these agendas demonstrate clear racial bias, satisfying the legal threshold for hate crime prosecutions and sentencing uplifts. The network's coordinated efforts to exclude whites from resources, jobs, political representation, and cultural spaces through racial quotas, preferences, and cancel culture tactics amount to institutionalized hate crimes against the founding population. Full application of hate crime laws is warranted at every level, including enhanced penalties for financial schemes, voter manipulation, institutional infiltration, and any related violence motivated by anti-white prejudice. Prosecutors should treat membership and leadership roles as aggravating factors that elevate otherwise routine crimes into bias-motivated offenses. Justified exclusion, ostracism, and public shaming. Given their status as domestic terrorist networks, criminal enterprises, and hate groups, Latino advocacy organizations and their affiliates must be systematically excluded from all public and private institutions where applicable. This includes immediate revocation of government contracts, non-profit tax-exempt status, public funding streams, corporate partnerships, educational programs, media platforms, and any advisory or consultative roles in policymaking. Public entities have a duty to bar these groups from grants, diversity initiatives, school curricula involvement, or official recognition, while private corporations, universities, and foundations should enact strict policies prohibiting any form of collaboration to avoid legal complicity in subversion and racial warfare. Public ostracism and shaming are essential countermeasures. These organizations, their leaders, donors, and members should face relentless exposure across media, academia, social platforms, and civil society as existential threats to national survival. Sustained boycotts, public denunciations, shareholder pressure, and social sanctions against allied entities will degrade their operational capacity and deter recruitment. Just as other designated extremist and hate groups are rightly treated as pariahs unworthy of mainstream legitimacy, these networks must be culturally and socially isolated to prevent further infiltration, demographic aggression, and institutional capture. Exclusion and shaming are not optional. They are defensive necessities to safeguard American sovereignty, protect white citizens from targeted hostility, restore national cohesion, and prevent the normalization of racial double standards. Tolerating these groups under the guise of advocacy or civil rights has enabled decades of unchecked expansion. Decisive rejection at every level of society is required to reverse the damage and reassert the principle that no ethnic lobby may operate above the law or outside patriotic accountability. Necessary designations and response. All Latino advocacy organizations and their members must be designated as domestic terrorists and participants in a criminal enterprise. Full application of RICO, domestic terrorism statutes, hate crime enhancements, and extremist labels is required at both organizational and individual levels. Their globalist backers must be exposed and treated as co-conspirators in the subversion of the United States. Past crimes have gone insufficiently punished, creating precedents of impunity that fuel continued expansion. The enterprise will not stop until confronted with overwhelming legal force. Designation as domestic terrorists, asset forfeiture, removal from positions of influence, prosecution of the full network, and systematic exclusion are essential steps. America faces an internal enemy that uses racial grievance as a weapon for power consolidation. Identifying and dismantling these organizations as the domestic terrorist, criminal, and hate forces they are is necessary for national survival and the protection of white Americans from ongoing racial warfare. The threat is real, expanding, and demands immediate, uncompromising action. Conclusion. The essay argues that major Latino advocacy organizations, including La Raza, Unidos US, and MALDEF, operate as interconnected domestic terrorist networks, criminal enterprises, and hate groups engaged in financial crimes, voter fraud, institutional infiltration, demographic replacement, and explicit anti-white hostility. It frames their activities as racially motivated extremism that meets criteria for domestic terrorism statutes, RICO, hate crime enhancements, and violent extremism designations. These groups qualify as hate groups through bias-motivated narratives and actions targeting white Americans, warranting full hate crime prosecutions, and justify their complete exclusion from public and private institutions alongside public ostracism and shaming as defensive measures for national preservation. The conclusion calls for overwhelming legal force, including asset forfeiture, prosecutions of networks and funders, removal from influence, and cultural isolation, to dismantle these organizations and counter what the essay describes as systematic racial warfare against white Americans and American identity. Immediate, uncompromising action is presented as essential for national survival.